Hey everybody, this is Andy. I wanted to share with you a video of a recent conversation I had with Professor Allan Lichtman. Professor Allan Lichtman came up with a system to accurately predict the presidential elections. He has been accurately predicting presidential elections since 1984. He was a guest on the Naked Diner podcast, and in case you didn't hear it on the podcast, I thought I would package it up in a video format. And that's what it is. It's basically going to be hearing the conversation I had along with Jack Paterko with Professor Allan Lichtman of American University. And we had a really good time, and I hope you enjoy it. Bye.
Hello.
All right, we have a half an hour with Professor Lichtman's time, and we're gonna go with a crazy half hour. That's what we're gonna do.
Let's go.
I'm ready.
Jump then.
Professor Allan Lichtman, you are the purveyor of many unpleasant truths. And I like unpleasant truths, so this is a safe space for everyone here.
Cool.
Do I understand that we don't have a constitutional right to vote?
That is absolutely correct. Not only isn't there a right to vote in the original Constitution, there is no right to vote in the Bill of Rights among the plethora of rights established in 1791. And all subsequent amendments dealing with the vote are phrased negatively in terms of what the states cannot do rather than establishing a positive right to vote. So the 15th Amendment says, in essence, you can't deny the right to vote because of race, color, or condition of previous servitude. The suffrage amendment says you can't deny the right to vote because of sex, and the 18-year-old amendment says you can't deny the right to vote on the grounds of someone being under 21 or at least 18 years or older. So they're all phrased negatively. The framers originally punted voting rights to the states, and all subsequent enactments in the Constitution have done likewise.
So in theory, let's say if Rhode Island, we'll just take a random state, decided no one was going to vote at all, just rescind all voting rights, would the federal government have anything to say about it?
It probably would under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, although directly you could not say it violates the right to vote under the Constitution since it did not exist. It would also violate the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So you couldn't do that, but you'd have to go about it indirectly rather than saying, hey, you can't do that because the Constitution says Americans have a right to vote. By the way, virtually every other nation has a right to vote in their Constitution, including constitutions over which the United States had a lot of influence, like the post-war constitutions of Japan and Germany. And yet, ironically, there is this huge hole in our Constitution.
And why is that?
Well, the framers spent very little time, actually, remarkably, on voting rights, even though, the Revolutionary War cry was no representation, no taxation without representation. They spent little time on what representation really meant. At the time, remember, the framers were a bunch of elite white men. And at the time, elite white men believed that the right to vote was not a right at all, but a privilege, and a privilege accorded to only those who had a stake in society and had sufficient independence to cast a wise and uncoerced vote. And they believed that only property holders or perhaps taxpayers, which was almost co-equal with property holders, fulfilled those requirements. So the debates in the Constitutional Convention were never about establishing a right to vote, which they didn't believe in, beyond this limited class. It was rather about, should we put economic qualifications in the Constitution? And ultimately, the resolution was not on principle, but was rather practical. First of all, they couldn't agree on what economic qualifications could apply to all the states. And secondly, remember, Constitution was kind of an illegal document. the Convention of 1787 was not authorized to frame a new government. It was authorized only to amend the Articles of Confederation. So to establish the new Constitution, they needed the support of the states, at least 3/4, and of course they wanted unanimous support. And so to get the support of the states, they did not want to override the prerogatives of the states to set their own qualifications for the vote. So the states were essentially unconstrained in deciding who should vote. And most states, of course, had property or tax-paying qualifications. Some of them had white-only qualifications. Actually, most didn't. That would change by the eve of the Civil War. Almost all states had white-only qualifications. And except for a brief period, remarkably, in New Jersey, all the states accorded the vote only to males. There were also residential requirements for voting. You had to reside in the state or in the locality for a certain period of time, and other qualifications placed on the vote as well. And there was essentially no recourse to any right to vote in the federal Constitution.
Very interesting. I heard you say that there was a ballot initiative in Florida from the League of Women Voters to fight gerrymandering in that state. You want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, ironically, Florida was the epicenter of what many believe was the stolen election of 2000, when George W. Bush won Florida by 537 votes, and there was a lot of voter suppression of African-American Democrats. But remarkably, the League of Women Voters and other grassroots organizations sponsored an anti-gerrymandering constitutional amendment, which passed overwhelmingly in Florida with more than 60% of the vote. And as a result, the courts, in construing that amendment, forced Florida to redraw both its state legislative and its congressional districts, which resulted in much fairer, maybe not perfectly fair maps, but at least much fairer maps than had been in place under the egregious gerrymanders that had taken place after the 2010 census. And Florida, ironically, is now a model for what the states can do to combat gerrymandering. And Andrew, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Back in 1787, the Congress booted voting to the states. And just recently, a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court booted gerrymandering to the states, saying, we don't like gerrymandering, but we do not think the federal courts have any role in combating gerrymandering. That, in effect, deflected it back to the states. And already, just this week, we saw a court decision in North Carolina which outlawed the state legislative gerrymander in that state by the Republican majority in the legislature, and ordered the legislature to redraw new, fairly drawn districts. And this was not under the federal Constitution, but was under right to vote provisions in the state Constitution. So the real action on gerrymandering and voting rights is very likely to be in the states, not at the federal level.
Very good, very good. One of the reasons why I wanted you to come on the podcast, and of course, I'm sure as the election is getting closer, you're going to get more invitations, is to talk about the keys to the White House.
Right. The keys
before we get into the reason, my confusion and anger about the Democratic Party not really following some of the advice that you would give them, let's just go over what the keys are.
Yeah. I developed the keys to the White House in 1981, when I was 9. No, not really, but as a result of an unusual collaboration with the world's leading geophysicist, the world's expert in earthquake prediction, Vladimir Borak, who has since sadly passed away, but he was 95, so he did live a long life. And what we did was we reconceptualized presidential elections in earthquake terms, not as Republican versus Democrat, liberal versus conservative, Carter versus Reagan. Remember, this is 81, but as stability. The party holding the White House keeps the White House. Note I say the party, not necessarily the sitting president who might not be running, and earthquake. the party holding the White House is turned out. That insight enabled us to reconceptualize presidential elections as essentially referenda up or down on the performance and strength of the party holding the White House. And we looked at every election from the horse and buggy days when Abraham Lincoln beat Stephen Douglas in 1860 to the days of polls and jet planes and computers when Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter in 1980. And we came up with 13 key questions to gauge whether there would be stability or upheaval. And they primarily relate, as I noted, to the strength and performance of the party holding the White House. And the way it works is if the party holding the White House loses 6 or more of the 13 keys, they are predicted losers. If they lose fewer than 6, they are predicted winners. And the keys deal with the big picture. They have very little to do with what the pundits and the TV analysts, spend hundreds of millions of dollars pontificating about. They look at the big picture, things like midterm election results, third parties, internal party contests for the party holding the White House, incumbency, the long and short-term economy, policy change, social unrest, scandal, foreign policy successes and failures. The only keys that have anything to do with the candidates themselves are very high threshold keys, whether the incumbent candidate is charismatic or national hero, and whether the challenging candidate is charismatic or national hero. By that I mean a Ronald Reagan, a Franklin Roosevelt, a Teddy Roosevelt, the once in a generation kind of candidates. And it's really easy to do. It's just yes or no. You don't have to take your shoes off. What you got to do is count to 6, right? And
Right.
It's the world's only do-it-yourself prediction system. Anyone can buy my book, see how the keys are defined, see how they've been answered, and answer them themselves and become an election forecaster. One very important caveat. When I first developed the keys in 81, there was really no dissonance between the popular vote and the electoral college vote. You had to go back to a whole different era, 1888, to find the divergence, and that was because of the one-party South. That's changed now, and the reason it's changed is in any close election, regardless of the outcome in the electoral college, the Democrats are going to win the popular vote, and the reason is simple. They pick up 5 to 6 million extra votes in New York and California alone. Those extra votes count for 0 in the electoral college. They could win New York and California by 1 vote and still get all the electoral college votes. So I no longer talk about the popular vote. I just predict the presidential winner, like I did in 2016 in my September Washington Post interview when I said that the next president was going to be Donald Trump. Let me assure you, that did not get me a lot of love here
Professor
in overwhelmingly Democratic Washington, D.C.
I was saying on this podcast and on my blog that Trump was going to win in 2016, and I got absolutely no love, and afterwards, absolutely, and still none whatsoever.
I did get some love. Guess who sent me a letter?
I saw that you were on Fox News.
Donald Trump himself wrote to me and said, "Congrats, Professor, good call. Donald J. Trump," in Sharpie, his black magic marker, on the September Washington Post issue where I had made my predictions. So I did get something from a very unexpected quarter. But of course, all the pundits who are all wrong. I have to say, I'm not a vindictive person, but I got a little bit of pleasure on election night watching the conventional pundits tie themselves into knots. Trying to explain why something happened that they said couldn't possibly happen. So now, of course, they've all forgotten about my prediction, which was well publicized, was all over the media, and said, "Oh well, don't blame us. Everybody got 2016 wrong." No, they didn't. You and I got it right.
So, from what I understand, from what you're telling me, approximately 90 to 95% of what we hear about the presidential election is pretty much bunk.
Take it and do with it what the great philosopher David Hume says you should do with works of superstition. Consign it to the flames. That's right. And not only is it wrong, it's pernicious because it leads us down the primrose path. It leads us to these shallow, soundbite driven, ad driven campaigns. When campaigning by the keys would say you campaigned for a mandate. So if you win, you have a basis for governing that could let you win. Again, it's pernicious. But, my explanation is the Iron Triangle. Remember Dwight Eisenhower in 1961 in his farewell address warned about the military-industrial complex, which was the Iron Triangle of the defense contractors, the military, and the congresspersons in the Senate and the House who benefited from having defense contracts in their states and their districts. Now we have the consultant candidate media Iron Triangle. The consultants, the candidates, and the media are all caught up in this conventional wisdom. The consultants do it because that's how they make their money. Otherwise, they're irrelevant. The media does it because by making believe it's the day-to-day junk of the campaign that really matters. That's how they make their money. They have to cover it day-to-day. And, of course, the politicians are afraid. They're chickens. They're cowards. They're afraid to depart from the conventional wisdom of the consultants and the media. I've been shouting at them for 30 years, and they never listen.
There's too much money in it, that's why.
Too much money. They're all making money. Huge. We're talking billions of dollars here, just like the military-industrial complex. It's not as big, but
right.
It's as strong.
What were you going to say, Jack?
I think that the issue with the media is it's not necessarily that they're not paying attention to the keys, but they're hyper focused on the charisma part, and they spend all their time focused on that and ignore all this other stuff going on,
which is the big picture. And they're hyper focused on the day to day because they have to put out a story.
They've got you got to do an hour show if you got to do an hour
That's
show, right?
Right.
There's a lot of fill up airtime that happens.
Yeah, I mean, these media folks, they're my friends. I'm not saying they're stupid or misguided or evil. They're good people. They're smart, but they have to get on there every single day and tell a different story as though it matters. Plus, of course, they're addicted to the polls.
Right, and
the pollsters keep the score, even though the polls are meaningless. That's how they say who's leaping ahead and falling behind. It's the entertainment. It's the horse race.
Yeah, and at some point, you spend all day, every day, paying attention to this stuff, and you kind of lose sight of what the average person sitting at home who's only watching maybe a half an hour of news before watching Jimmy Kimmel, and that's their news intake.
You're absolutely right, and that's why I always say, another one of my sayings is, keep your eye on the big picture. The day-to-day micro stuff doesn't matter. I also have some advice for the Democrats, very poignant advice, which they so far likewise have not followed. My wife, Karen Strickler, is a brilliant political analyst. She was head of the National Endangered Species Coalition. She was head of Maryland NARAL when they codified Roe versus Wade for the women of Maryland. So even if the Supreme Court overturns it, the women of Maryland are protected. And back in 2003, she wrote an article called The Do Nothing Strategy, the Plague of Progressive Politics.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and that's what they're doing now, the Do Nothing Strategy. Democrats have been in power, what, eight months? And they haven't laid a glove on Donald Trump.
Now, there's going to be people who would argue, who would push back and say that they have investigations going on.
Yeah, and that plays right into Donald Trump's hands. All these, different investigations that no one is paying any attention to in 6 or 7 committees. And what is Donald Trump the master of? Deflection and distraction. What they have to do is what they did with Richard Nixon, right? Focus it in. And the only way you can focus it in now, since you're not going to get a Senate Select Committee like you did in Watergate, is a formal impeachment investigation where all the sins of Donald Trump are brought together and portrayed dramatically to the public. I just get sick when I hear these Democratic politicians mouthing the do nothing strategy. Oh, we're not there yet. The public isn't behind us. They're putting the cart before the horse. Of course the public isn't behind us because you've done nothing to get the public behind you.
The public hasn't really seen the evidence, yeah.
Right. When they started the inquiry into Richard Nixon, his approval rating was 67%. Even before the impeachment vote in the House Judiciary Committee, it was down to 24%. Sentiment for impeachment went from 19% to 54%. Today, it's almost 40%. You only need to move another 10 to 15% of the public, and you haven't done a darn thing. It's congressional malpractice. It's enabling evil, and the enablers of evil are as bad as the perpetrators of evil.
That's fantastic. I love it when you say that. That's great. I think that's a sentiment that I share, and I've been talking about the need for impeachment just for those reasons. The idea that you need, Donald Trump, despite all of his sins, he is the master of the show. He knows how to produce a show, and Democrats just aren't producing a show, to run counter to that.
No, if Donald Trump is producing the greatest show on earth, they're producing the molehill of a show.
Right.
So of course the public isn't there because you haven't given them the show they need. And it's so obvious. It's not as if, there's no evidence of impeachable offenses. 10 clear obstruction of justice violations, 2 campaign finance felonies for which the Southern District of New York has already laid out all of the evidence, contempt of Congress, for which Richard Nixon was impeached, violation of the Emoluments Clause, which said you can't profit from your presidency, undermining the free press, dividing us. I could go on and on. But there are, even if you think only crimes, and that's of course not true, there are the crimes of obstruction of justice, and there are the crimes of violating the campaign finance laws, which are not technical violations. The campaign finance laws were designed to circumvent the corruption of our elections. There's a violation of the Constitution's Emoluments Clause, which the framers said the remedy for that is impeachment. I could go on and on and on. What are they waiting for?
Professor Lichtman, I'm sure that you've done this. I'm sure that you've talked about this. Whoever knows you has asked you about this right now. As we're talking, how many keys have turned against President Trump? Three.
And what are those three? That's why impeachment is so critical. The 3 are the midterm elections, the fact that Trump is not a Ronald Reagan who has broad appeal, and no foreign policy success. If you did impeachment, and I'm sure an impeachment inquiry would lead to articles of impeachment, that's a 4th key. And by the way, the Democrats are not only wrong morally and constitutionally, they're wrong politically. They misread the impeachment of Bill Clinton. They think, there was a big backlash against that. We don't want that to happen again. Yeah, the Republicans lost a few House seats, but they kept control of the House. And guess what they won? The biggest prize in American politics, the presidency in 2000 by 537 votes in Florida. When George Bush was campaigning on restoring integrity and honesty to the White House, and 1/4 of the electorate said the impeachment scandal was important in their voting. So not only are they wrong morally and constitutionally, they misread history as well. They're wrong on every single count, every single regard.
What are the other 2 keys?
So they lost 3. The impeachment scandal would be 4, and that could open up other keys to be lost as well. It could spark a real third-party campaign, prompt a real challenge to the president. And of course, there's lots of other keys that could fall. Foreign policy, disaster, for example. But without that scandal key, the Democrats are in very tough shape, and they're in danger of making the same mistake they made in 2016, following the polls, following the pundits, and thinking, we can easily beat Donald Trump by doing nothing, the do-nothing strategy. He'll just beat himself and we'll waltz into the White House. They could not be more wrong.
See, I would say, in terms of your Richard Nixon comparison that keeps coming up, they're in danger of making the same mistake that they made then, of their party being just so their primary was so fractious in campaign, and they cut each other down so much that by the time it got to the election, Nixon won on a walk.
You're talking about 72?
Yeah.
Nixon was going to win no matter what in 72. He had rigged that election so, pumped up the economy, had opened up China. The keys were very much aligned with him. When I first wrote the edition of my book in 1991, one of my endorsers was George McGovern, the Democratic loser in 72. And he wrote this great line. He said, "Thank God for the keys to the White House. They prove that 1972 was not all my fault." And by the way, another thing Democrats need to know, they can fight all they want. There is no challenger internal battle key. It's only an incumbent internal fight. You know, you had this bitter fight in 2008 between Clinton and Obama, and they still won. You had this horrendously divisive primary among, a dozen Republicans in 2016, and they won. It's only when the governing party gets to have this big battle that it counts.
Right.
Another thing that everyone gets wrong.
Right. So when Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders had
that was a key against them. Yes.
Right, because they were in the incumbent party.
Yes, you got it right.
Very good. So in terms of challenger charisma, because that's one of the 13 keys.
Yes, and that would be very important if we get impeachment.
When you
That'll be a fifth key.
when you look at our people on the Democratic side, does anyone in that midbrain way, in that gut way, makes you think that's the person that could bring the ball over the line?
Yeah, not Biden, not Sanders. Sanders maybe 4 years ago, but his is a little bit of a tired act. I originally thought Harris, but no longer. I think, she's proven to be. So the ones who I think have charismatic potential would be Booker, Warren, and Buttigieg.
All right.
It remains to be seen because none of these candidates are all that well known yet, We forget, again, because we follow these things, how little known even Elizabeth Warren is.
It's true.
It really is. People that don't know who they are. They still need to really establish themselves. And of all the candidates, I think the one who has learned the most was Warren. I had kind of written her off after she botched the Pocahontas thing, but boy, she's really learned from that. And the one who learned the least is Harris.
Yeah. So, Professor Lichtman, we're coming down to the last few minutes of our conversation.
Okay.
Our last question that we always like to ask our guest is there a question you wanted us to ask you, but we didn't? And this isn't about plugs or where people can find you online, but rather this is about, was there a topic you wanted to chat about that we didn't?
Can you ask me about my next book?
Sir, tell me everything you want about your next book.
My next book is a blockbuster. It is called Repeal the Second Amendment for a Safer America. And believe me, I started this book before the recent round, obviously, of horrific massacres. It's coming out, St. Martin's Press, at the very beginning of the year, can already be pre-ordered. And my argument is this: the gun control movement has overwhelming public support. And yet, it has not only done nothing since the assault weapons ban in 1994, a quarter century ago, it's gone backwards. And the reason is the NRA and the gun lobby has shielded themselves in the Second Amendment in a complete misreading and distortion of the Second Amendment, which was never meant to confer a broad right to private arms. It was always meant to safeguard the nation through a well-regulated militia. And I go through the whole history proving that. In fact, the NRA admitted that in internal memos that I found that no one has ever seen until it began to reinvent it, remember, under Charlton Heston, very late in the 20th century. The Supreme Court never recognized an individual right to arms under the Second Amendment for over 200 years, until 2008, 5-4 decision written by, who wrote it, Justice Scalia, of course. So the NRA and the gun lobby has invented this completely distorted view of the Second Amendment, shielding their horrific opposition to any kind of gun control. And the gun control movement has fallen into their trap. Their argument is, we support the Second Amendment, but if you look at what Barack Obama said, look at what Hillary Clinton said, look at what John Kerry said, their rhetoric is almost identical. That is a weak defensive position that will never, ever win. Moreover, even if they did win with this conservative Supreme Court, anything we get on gun control is likely to be overturned anyway. So the movement has to do with what the gay rights movement finally did in the 21st century. go for the jugular. Gay rights movement in the 21st century finally decided we're not settling for second-class citizenship. We're not settling, for civil rights of marriage. We're only going for full gay marriage. And when they started, there was 27% public support, about the same that there is now for repeal of the Second Amendment. Now there's over 60%. And what did they do? A concerted grassroots movement. And that's what my book is all about. Repeal the Second Amendment for a Safer America. It goes through the history. It gives all the tools of how to attack the gun lobby's complete distortion and misreading of the Second Amendment. Let me end on one critical point. Gun lobby says more guns make us safer, right? And they don't really care who gets the guns. Well, if that were true, America would be the safest of all advanced democracies in the world by far. In fact, we're the least safe. What is the country that has the strongest gun controls among democracies? Japan. You know how many murders Japan had in the last reporting year by gunfire? Three. We had 14,500. 14,500 to 3. If that doesn't just blow away, and maybe that's the wrong word, everything the NRA and the gun lobby tells you, I don't know what does. And they have about a third of the population, so it's not, they would have 9 gun murders per capita, not 14,500.
Would repealing the Second Amendment mean we would have to pass another amendment?
Yes, and there's precedent for that. Do you know what it is?
Prohibition.
Prohibition. And at the time, they were also, you'll never repeal prohibition. It's not possible. And I have a whole chapter on the repeal of prohibition in Repeal the Second Amendment, and I show how the repeal of prohibition could be a model for repeal of the Second Amendment, particularly right now, as the NRA and the gun lobby is reeling, not just from these horrific mass murders, which, by the way, are the tip of the iceberg. They're less than 1% of the almost 15,000 murders we have in America, but they capture public attention. So the NRA is not only reeling from these mass murders, but it's also reeling from its own internal corruption.
Right.
And
when is the book coming out?
The book will be out at the end of the year.
And
St.
the name
Martin's
of it?
Press. Repeal the Second Amendment for a Safer America.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. Professor Allan Lichtman, thank you for coming on the Naked Diner podcast. Where can people find you online, sir?
My Twitter is just at Allan Lichtman.
There you
Fantastic. I follow you on Twitter, and I always enjoy your tweets.
Thank you so much. Take care, guys. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Send me a link.
Definitely. I will.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.